Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. And this morning we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 10, Chapter 47, and the text for today is 58. It's on the board and we can chant responsively line by line. Eta param tanu rito bhuvi gopavadvo Govinda eva nikhilatmani rudha bhavaha Bachanta yao bava biyo munayo vayamsha. Kim Brahma Janma Bir Ananta Katana Sasya. Etan Param Tanu Brito Bhuvi Gopavadvo. Govinda Eva Nikhilatmani Rudha Bhavaha. Bachanta Yad Bhava Biyo Munayo Vayamsha. Kim Brahma Janma Birananta Katara Sasya. Eta Param Tanu Brito Bhuvi Gope Vadvo. Govinda Eva Nikhilatmani Rudha Bhavaha. Panchanta Yad Bhava Biyo Munayo Vayamsha. Kim Brahma Janma Birananta Katara Sasya. Please chant. Eta Param Tano Brupso Bhuvi Gope Vadvo. Govinda Eva Nikhilatmani Rudha Bhavaha. Panchantayat Bhava Biyo Munayo Vayamsha. Kim Brahma Janma Bidananta Katara Sasya. Eta Param Tanu Brito Bhuvi Gopavadvo. Govinda Eva Nikhilatmani Rudha Bhavaha. Panchantayat Bhava Biyo Manayo Vyamsha. Kim Brahma Janma Bir Ananta Katara Sasya. Eta Param Tanu Brito Bhuvi Gope Vadvo. Govinda Eva Nikhilatmani Rudha Bhavaha. Panchantayat Bhava Biyo Munayo Vayamsha. Kim Brahma Janma Bidananta Katara Sasya. The word for word meaning. Eta, these women. Param, alone. Tanu, their bodies. Brita, maintained successfully. Bhave, my computer, on the earth. Gopa, Badaba, the young cowherd woman, Govinda, for Lord Krishna, Eva, exclusively, Nikhila, of all, Atmana, the soul, Ruda, perfected, Bhavaha, ecstatic loving attraction, Vanshanti, they desire, Tat, which, Bhave, I didn't double check my spelling, material existence, Bia, those who are afraid of, Manaya, sages, Vayam, we, Cha, also, Kim, what use, Brahma, as a Brahmana or as Lord Brahma, Janmabhi, with births, Ananta, of the unlimited Lord, Kasha, for the topics, Rasasya, for one who has a taste. And the translation for text 58 is as follows. Uddhava sang, among all persons on earth, these cowherd women alone have actually perfected their embodied lives, for they have achieved the perfection of unalloyed love for Lord Govinda. Their pure love is hankered after by those who fear material existence, by great sages, and by ourselves as well. For one who has tasted the narrations of the infinite Lord, what is the use of taking birth as a high-class Brahmana or even as Lord Brahma himself? In the purport, the disciples of Srila Prabhupada, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti explains that here the term Brahma Janmabhi, Brahminical births, refers to the threefold birth by 1, seminal parenthood, 2, sacred thread initiation, and 3, sacrificial initiation. These cannot compare to pure Krishna consciousness. In fact, Sri Uddhava, who spoke this verse, took birth as a pure Brahmana, but he deprecates this position in comparison to that of the exalted gopis. Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurinmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Svapadanti Kam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakalmam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saita Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapsa Kanchana Gorangi Radha Vrindavan Ishvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyas Cha Kripa Sindhubhya Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Romapada Swami iti namine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami iti namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Good morning. this particular verse, text 58, I'm drawing on the commentary from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and part of his commentary was mentioned in the purport that I read. And Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he states that Uddhava, who's the speaker of this particular verse, describes the outstanding glories of the Vraja gopis. Gopis are the cowherd women. And he's describing these glories, in fact, in 5 verses, and this is the first of the 5. So from text 58 through 62 is going to be the glorification or the outstanding glories of these Vraja gopis. So that outstanding glory of the gopis lies in the fact that they have perfected their lives. And the Sanskrit term had been Tanu Rito, because they had achieved, and again the Sanskrit had been Ruda Bhavaha. The translation is, they had achieved ecstatic loving attraction to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and this is considered to be the perfection of their embodied lives. So meaning they occupy a particular body, the spirit soul is within that body, and the perfection of being in their particular body, this body of a cowherd woman, was that they had achieved this loving attraction to the Supreme Being, Lord Krishna. So this statement of Uddhava, put into a song form, because this was sung, this particular verse that we've chanted, is a view of perfection. And this view of perfection, it's expanded upon by Krishna, or we can expand upon it by Krishna's definition of perfection. And this we find in Bhagavad Gita 12:2, where Krishna gives a definition of perfection. Those who fix their minds on my personal form and are always engaged in worshipping me with great and transcendental faith are considered by me to be the most perfect. And the Sanskrit, Mai avesyu mano yemam nitya yukta upasate shradaya parayo petas te me yuktatma mataha. And drawing from Srila Prabhupada's explanation on this definition of perfection given by Lord Krishna, he explains that there are persons that are considered to be the most perfect in yoga. And for such persons, there are no material activities, because every single activity is done for Krishna, which means that the activity, by virtue of it being done for Krishna, becomes a spiritual activity. It's no longer a material activity, even if to the external view it appears to be a material activity, because the consciousness is dictating that that activity is for pleasing the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and so the activity is spiritualized. And in fact, as Srila Prabhupada reiterates, and these are his words, whatever he does not let a single moment pass without devoting his activities to Krishna. Such action is in full Samadhi. Close quote. So it's not merely that it's a matter of performing a material activity with the consciousness that it's for Krishna and spiritualizing it, but in fact, there's complete awareness all the time that the activities are being done for the purpose of pleasing Lord Krishna. So deliberately, not even a moment is being allowed to pass without devoting the activity to Lord Krishna. So that's a case for the perfected yogi, that particular definition that Lord Krishna has given of somebody who's completely fixed their mind on him and is devoting every activity to him. Um, yeah. So, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he's elucidating Uddhava's thought presented in this song, this glorification of the gopis that Uddhava is proceeding to embark upon. And we see, or rather he sees Uddhava qualifying this perfection of the gopis. This perfection is something which cannot be achieved by those striving for liberation. And that Sanskrit there was bhava biyo. So this is posed as a question to Krishna, interestingly enough, by Arjuna, who's also interested in which is more perfect of the processes for realizing the absolute truth. So this is Arjuna's question. So I'm bringing this up because it's very much connected to how Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is analyzing Uddhava's particular reasoning process, you could say. So Arjuna had asked this question: which are considered to be more perfect? Those who are always properly engaged in your devotional service, or those who worship the unmanifested, impersonal Brahman? It was a question posed by Arjuna. Bhagavad Gita 12:1. So I'll read the Sanskrit. Evam satatayuktaye bhaktastvam paryupasate yechapi aksharam avyaktam tesham ke yoga vitamaha. So meditation on the impersonal Brahman, or persons who are meditating on the impersonal Brahman, are categorized as impersonalists, while those who worship the Supreme Lord directly through trying to perform service in devotion to him, they're termed personalists. But both categories are transcendentalists. The impersonalists, those meditating on the impersonal Brahman, have this preference for meditating on the impersonal form of the absolute truth, which is beyond the reach of the senses, and it's not even apparent to the senses. So Srila Prabhupada states that meditation on the impersonal manifestation, because it's also a manifestation of the Supreme Absolute Being, this impersonal manifestation, Srila Prabhupada is stating that whether this meditation is in this material world or it's in the spiritual world of the Supreme Lord, it's actually a problem for meditation. This is Srila Prabhupada's his view, because he's a personalist. He gives the reason that one cannot perfectly conceive of the impersonal feature of the absolute truth. That is, one cannot hold a form in the mind or express in words that impersonal feature. So that's why it's a problem. It's very difficult to grasp. So this category of transcendentalists, in approaching Godhead, have to control the senses, they have to render service to everyone, and they have to engage in welfare for all beings. So the impersonal meditators, the impersonal meditating transcendentalists, they have to also go through a process of serving humanity, of engaging in welfare for all living beings. And they have to control their senses. And Srila Prabhupada explains that there's difficulty, however, in the approach of the impersonal transcendentalists. And this is how Srila Prabhupada puts it. In order to perceive the super soul within the individual soul, one has to cease the sensual activities of seeing, hearing, tasting, working, etc., then one comes to understand that the Supreme Soul is everywhere. Realizing this, one envies no living entity. He sees no difference between man and animal because he sees soul only, not the outer covering, close quote. So the impersonal transcendentalist, he actually has to be extremely strict and controlled with his senses. He actually has to allow himself not to see too much. He has to allow himself not to hear too much. He has to allow himself not to taste too much. And he also should not be working much. And in this way, because he's withdrawn all his senses from contact with objects that the senses need, meaning sound, taste, form, he actually gets this opportunity where he begins to realize that actually the Supreme Soul is along with his individual soul dwelling within. And in this way, he comes to understand, oh, every living entity actually has within him both the individual soul and the Supreme Soul. So actually, he starts to only begin to see the soul. He doesn't see the outer covering. You know, is it a creature, a six-legged creature with a black body? Is it a creature with wings? Is it a creature with claws? Is it a biped creature? He doesn't see the outer covering. He merely starts to see the spiritual being, the soul within and the Supreme Soul. So that's the impersonal transcendentalist. But it's very extreme, the austerity that the impersonal transcendentalist has to perform, like literally cutting off contact of the senses with any sense objects, going completely within. And in the Bhagavatam, there's numerous examples from a previous age where you have impersonal transcendentalists even choosing to meditate underwater, you know, blocking off all the senses. And because in the previous ages it was possible to live a much longer lifespan, you know, multiplied by 100 to our present lifespan, these meditators would actually go for hundreds of years in this kind of way to realize the supreme absolute truth. So this particular breakdown I've given is coming from Srila Prabhupada's purport in Bhagavad Gita 12.5. Now, liberation, which is the other point that Uddhava is making, that not even persons who are liberated can actually be as exalted as these simple cowherd women in Vrindavan. So looking at this point of liberation, liberation, in fact, means that a person becomes free from the wrong consciousness, meaning that he is master and he has, instead, he tries to become a servant of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is a definition given by Srila Prabhupada of what liberation means. It's a complete shift in consciousness. One's no longer viewing oneself as the control of everything around oneself, but rather, oh, I'm actually serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Now, Uddhava, his thought, as elucidated by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he states that even those who are liberated, munayo was the word used, do not achieve unalloyed love for Lord Govinda. So persons who've even shifted their consciousness in this kind of way, that, you know, I'm not the master and control of the world, they too do, even though they're free from that wrong consciousness of thinking they're the master of everything around them, and they're thinking they have to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead, still they do not necessarily achieve this complete and utter love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Govinda. Srila Prabhupada, he points out that there are 5 kinds of liberation. So the Sanskrit is Sayuja Mukti, Salakya Mukti, Shashti Mukti, Mukti meaning liberation, Sampiya Mukti. So the first Mukti or liberation in this listing of Srila Prabhupada, this Sayuja Mukti, it's the liberation of persons who are speculating. So mentally they're trying to find the absolute truth through taking ideas and refining ideas. So it's very much on the mental plane. So the liberation they achieve, so they're understanding they're not the supreme controllers of everything around them, even though they have this great mental capacity. Still, those persons, through their speculation, they come to have more of that understanding of the impersonalist school of thought, which is one of wanting to merge into the spiritual existence, the supreme impersonal Brahmajyoti, it's called, the effulgence of the supreme personality of Godhead. So what they are hoping to achieve is a kind of sameness or oneness, because there's an understanding that in this world there's a great deal of variety, but the variety doesn't necessarily bring peace. So surely peace and happiness will come from eliminating the variety. So hence this idea of merging into a oneness, a spiritual oneness. It's going to avoid this variety, and hence there's equanimity, sameness. Now further light can be thrown on achieving Krishna via, and this is an explanation given by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He was the, Srila Prabhupada was, his spiritual master was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and preceding Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And his explanation of what it means to achieve the eternal truth, and this is how he explains it. His explanation is that pure existence, so meaning beyond material knowledge, is attainable by conditioned souls, meaning all the souls in this material world who are predisposed to like functioning in a particular way, like hearing certain sounds, like tasting particular foodstuffs, so conditioned. There's patterns of behavior. He explains that all these conditioned souls, they can attain this pure existence beyond material knowledge through pure absolute samadhi. And this is how he explains it. It's of 2 types. So samadhi being meditation on the supreme absolute truth. He says there's artificial samadhi and absolute samadhi. So the samadhi accepted by practicing devotional service to the Supreme is considered to be natural or absolute samadhi. The samadhi proposed by the Gyanis, meaning those who are trying to attain the absolute truth through speculative processes, meaning, mental wrestling, is considered to be practicing devotion, in a sense, to the Supreme through an artificial way, or it's fabricated. This is Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's distinction he's making. And the justification for this understanding is as follows. The soul is spiritual. Therefore, the qualities of self-knowledge and that knowledge of other objects is naturally present in the soul. By the quality of self-knowledge, one can realize oneself as the spirit soul. By the quality of knowing other objects, one can realize all other objects. So this is natural to the soul. It has this capacity for self-knowledge. And Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he argues that a living entity does not need to take shelter of another instrument to understand the supreme object, the supreme being. So the samadhi is considered to be faultless because it's natural. It's taking into account this capacity of the soul to have self-knowledge, to be able to understand other objects from a spiritual perspective. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he expands the understanding that the devotees of Krishna, the personalists, those who are actually worshipping the absolute truth in a personal form, they come to realize that self-realization comes through self-illumination, and that self-realization is the only way to establish these truths, as opposed to establishing truths such as the soul's eternality through argument. So this is Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Through this natural samadhi, this natural meditation, self-realization and the practice of the self-realization in the natural way, then there's a realization of the following objects, because the soul has that capacity for self-illumination, and there comes to be an understanding of other objects, moving towards and getting closer to the supreme object, Lord Krishna, the personalist approach. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur breaks it down into, he lists 12 points. I'm going to read 10 of them because it's of relevance to this discussion. So this is how that realization of objects takes place for a person practicing this natural samadhi, taking into account the natural illumination that happens from self-knowledge, because that's the quality that the soul has. Number one, there's realization of the self. One comes to understand, oh, the self is a spiritual being, number one. Number two, one understands the insignificance of the self. When one understands, oh, one is a spiritual being, but yet I'm teeny tiny. I'm caught in this one body, but there are so many other spiritual beings. 3, the supreme shelter. So one of the third realization that comes is that actually there's a much more capable, more fully realized being, the supreme being, who's actually the shelter of those that are working towards realization of that supreme being. 4, one comes to understand the relationship between the shelter and the sheltered. One comes to understand, oh, actually, as a minute spirit soul, I'm serving that supreme soul, because part of understanding is understanding that, oh, now there's a relationship. Myself as the minute spirit soul, I have a relationship with the supreme soul, the perfectly fully realized supreme soul. And he's providing shelter. 6, so these are all the breakdowns of the realizations that happen through taking this natural samadhi, this approach from, and this is Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's breakdown. 6, the relationship, this is another realization, the 6th realization, the relationships amongst the sheltered. So one comes to understand, oh, I have relationships with other spiritual souls. So it means that actually I have a relationship with that little ant walking across the floor. It's another spiritual being. I treat that entity with respect because that entity is also being sheltered by the Supreme Soul. 8, one comes to realize that the absolute time factor. And this is tackled by Krishna, where he says, time I am. So there's an understanding that on the corporeal level, one is restricted by time. There's going to be, while one is embodied, there's the beginning and there's an end point. But in actual fact, there's a continuity on the spiritual plane because the spirit soul is eternally existent. One comes to understand, this is the 9th point, practicing this natural samadhi, the various moods of the sheltered. And I'm going to go into this in a minute because we're going to actually look a little bit at the moods of the gopis, these exalted personalities that Uddhava is praising, because they've actually come to a point of fully realizing all these points. They're fully self-realized. They're fully connected to the Supreme Soul, the object of self-realization. So we're going to look a little bit at this point, the various moods of those that are sheltered. And 11 is the energies of the shelter. Also, we're going to look at that a little bit. And 12, the advancement and degradation of the sheltered by the energies of the shelter. So meaning there's going to be a flux and flow going on in that relationship, as one being the sheltered person in relation to the supreme shelter. And this sounds very abstract until you see it actually exemplified in the gopis, these cowherd women that Uddhava has come to witness their thought process and how they're showing these particular realizations. And just pausing for a minute before I go into elucidating from the writings in the Srimad Bhagavatam, something that illustrates these particular realizations for the personalists, those practicing natural samadhi, particularly these points of the various moods of the sheltered and the eternal pastimes between the shelter and the sheltered, because there's constant ongoing relationship. I'm just going to pause for a minute to say that Srila Bhaktivinoda states that the more one can advance on the path of samadhi, controlling argument, the more one can open up the storehouse and acquire spiritual truths. So it really is, it does not mean that one does not engage in logic and reasoning, but it means that one isn't relying on one's mental capacity to wrestle with ideas and fabricate truths, spiritual truths. Because the spiritual truths have to be, from the personalist school of thought, the spiritual truths have to be in relation to that supreme object, the supreme truth. And he himself has spoken all those truths in Bhagavad Gita, and we see something of the relationships of those that are taking shelter under that supreme shelter, that supreme absolute truth. So to illustrate these last few points of the realization that comes from those that are practicing this kind of natural samadhi, Uddhava has been exposed to different facets of these spiritual truths realized by the gopis. And Uddhava was exposed to the various moods of the sheltered, so to speak. That was one of the points of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur that one comes to realize as a person practicing this natural samadhi. And he got exposed to one of the principal gopis, Srimati Radharani, speaking. And this is her speaking. So you get some sense of this extraordinary mood that's there of someone who's actually taken shelter of that supreme object. Srimati Radharani speaks, and Uddhava gets exposed to this. we see nothing else he, meaning the Supreme Absolute Truth, might consider worth remembering as these cow pastures of Raja. Indeed, the bonds of affection for one's family members are difficult to break, even for a sage. So these words are coming, and one can understand that there's such great insight, and that's that self-illumination that comes through this process of self-realization. Lord Krishna, the supreme lovable object, has actually departed physically from Vrindavan. So Srimati Radharani is analyzing, and she's saying, there's actually nothing that's worthwhile for him to remember in these simple cowherd pastures. But she's thinking, he may perhaps be remembering his parents. So she's analyzing the bonds of affection for one's family members are difficult to break, even for a sage. So you're getting some sense of the mood that's there. And she carries on. Birds abandon a tree when the fruits are gone. Guests a house when they've eaten. Animals a forest that has been burnt down. And a lover, the woman he has enjoyed, even though she remains attached to him. So these thoughts give some insight into the moods that are happening in a highly self-realized being in relation to the Supreme Being. It's very much on a transcendental plane because it's elucidating the relationship that is of a very personal nature through this process of self-realization that's come to exist between these simple cowherd ladies and Lord Krishna's supreme lovable object. And because he's left, there's this a kind of, it almost appears like a kind of lamentation. But it's on a transcendental plane because it's transcendental love. It's not on a material plane. And looking further, there's this relationship between the shelter and the sheltered. So Srimati Radharani talking again, one of the cowherd women. Oh, bee, she's addressing a bee. Again, no distinction, understanding the spirit soul. Oh, bee, why do you sing here so much about the Lord of the Yadus, meaning Lord Krishna, the supreme lovable object, in front of us homeless people? These topics are old news to us. Better you sing about that friend of Arjuna in front of his new girlfriends, the burning desire in whose breast he has now relieved. Those ladies will surely give you the charity you are now begging. So there's, it's very charming, but there's lamentation on the part of Srimati Radharani and the other gopis that they've actually given up their homes to love Krishna in a conjugal relationship. They saw him as a husband. And the Lord left them. He's gone to Mathura, proceeding with his transcendental pastimes in a different location. And he's become a prince in a great city, is the way they put it, the city of the Yadus. So again, looking at another one of the realizations that comes through practicing this natural samadhi that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur listed, the various moods of the sheltered, which was something why I've read these particular statements made by Srimati Radharani. She actually is expressing a seed of jealousy, which you might have picked up there. There's anger, which arises from apparent disdain for Krishna being accompanied by a kind of sarcastic, sidelong glance, that's a description, directed at Krishna. So it's all on the transcendental plane. There's actually a seed of jealousy that now he's actually been satisfied by the woman in Mathura where he's gone. So this transcendental emotion, it's quite complex. It's a breakdown of various transcendental moods. And this one that I particularly read, it's called Vijalpa. And the definition of this transcendental kind of mood is sarcastic speech addressed to Krishna that openly expresses jealousy while at the same time hinting at angry pride. So you understand it's a complex thing, these simple statements of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur of, the moods that come to be there between the sheltered and the sheltered. I mean, at such an advanced level, it's actually the acharyas have even broken down the transcendental emotions. It's very carefully analyzed. Now, the gopis have perfected their lives through self-realization, such that they always realize their eternal occupation of service to Lord Krishna through this self-realization. And Srila Vishwanath, in elucidating Uddhava's thinking here in this verse from today, he says, this is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and I'm quoting, just through attraction to topics of the unlimited one can attain the highest achievement. And this is what you actually come to see in the gopis. They're completely absorbed in topics of Lord Krishna. Completely absorbed. And ending on this note, and this is visible in this statement as seeing something of the relationship between the sheltered and the sheltered. And this is the gopis addressing Uddhava. Oh, Uddhava, it is indeed regrettable that Krishna resides in Mathura. Does he remember his father's household affairs and his friends, the cowherd boys? Oh, great soul, does he ever talk about us, his maidservants? When will he lay on our heads his guru-centered hand? Close quote. So you get some insight into this relationship that they have with the Supreme Shelter. This waiting for Lord Krishna to bestow his blessings on them, putting his guru-centered hand on their heads. So the eternal pastimes between the shelter and the sheltered, they're very visible. And the insignificance of the self is seen too, and also the humility. And also a certain unsteadiness in the emotion. And also a certain eagerness. It's all interwoven in these, beautiful thoughts that the gopis had expressed and that Uddhava came to witness, and it's now led to him glorifying these gopis as the most exalted beings in the universe. So I tried to do a breakdown of today's verse looking from a very background perspective of this process of self-realization. And if there's any questions or thoughts on this topic to expand the discussion, please go ahead. Yes, Sabah.
Thanks, Krishna Archana. That was a very thorough analysis of the verse and super well researched.
Oh, thank you.
There is few things that just, while hearing, in terms is this type of paradoxical things that we find so many times in the philosophy, that depending on from the perspective that you see is a truth, but from another perspective is confusing. So one of these, you said that in the discussion of liberation, that those who are liberated, Uddhava is pointed out that they cannot achieve unalloyed love. Is that? And that in itself is, paradoxical in some way, because we see that liberated souls that are in Vaikuntha, they have unalloyed devotion for the Lord. Example, Prahlad Maharaj, Dhruva Maharaj, all kinds of personalities who have they're perfect beings. They're perfected. So liberated means, they're perfected beings. And if they're perfected beings, they're supposed to have that type of, unalloyed. Now, the paradox thing is that in Uddhava is saying there is something, they don't compare, they don't reach the level that the gopis have. So the understanding then is that there's also diversity within perfection. Prabhupada sometimes say perfect, most perfect, and something like perfect, more perfect, and most perfect. So it's also something a little bit unconceivable. So that's one thing. Another paradoxical term in the presentation was when you said the natural samadhi that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was discussing. And in natural samadhi, you mentioned that there is no need because it's already an intrinsic, the natural position of the soul is that it's full of knowledge. And so you don't need an external means to achieve that samadhi. You can do it, it's natural when you go into samadhi, you can reach those conclusions. But then we see Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita that it says that to achieve transcendental knowledge, you have to search for a spiritual master. So you need the assistance of someone who is there to help you get there. So it's not, Krishna doesn't say that you can do it on your own. Krishna says that you have to do it through his representative. So that's another thing. So from one perspective, yes, for the yogi, you can reach those things, just by meditation, but it's very difficult to present it, like that. But there's also the encouragement and the direction. You must seek for someone who's realized. And there was another one that that you mentioned too, that it was also
contestable.
Because depending on how you see it, this is some of the things that the philosophy is truth, but then there's other things that may questions like that. Anyway, so those are.
Yes, thank you very much. The first point you brought up of liberated persons, in the listing of the 5 kinds of liberation, I focused on the first one, the Sahuja, was it? Which is the liberation of the Gyanis, which is those who are cultivating knowledge. And you pointed out that actually you do get liberated souls in the Vaikuntha planets that actually are liberated and are considered to be perfect. So again, I took out of that list the first category because the first category falls into the impersonalist category. The other categories are the personalists. So the Vaikuntha residents are the personalists. They actually have engaged in direct devotional service to the Supreme Lord. So you hear the description that they actually, and Uddhava himself is one of those beings, their limbs resemble those of Lord Krishna. So their appearance is even similar to Lord Krishna. So that was one of the liberations. You go to live in a planet where the beings resemble Lord Krishna. That's Uddhava, Vaikuntha. And then in terms of the second point that you brought up, that I had stated that in the discussion that one doesn't need another instrument in this process of self-realization, that the soul naturally has this capacity of self-illumination. And you pointed out that still it's not that Lord Krishna is saying, yes, one can do it on one's own, not at all. He's actually very early on in the dilemma that poor Arjuna is experiencing, that on a corporeal level, he's actually going to be annihilating family members. Lord Krishna's response to him, where he's actually trying to remain on the corporeal level of even refusing to fight, Krishna is actually points out to him that he has to make a distinction between the body and the soul. So he tries to bring the knowledge to the spiritual side. And then further along in that discussion, Arjuna, understanding those points, he says, I'm a soul surrendered unto you. So indeed, Krishna instructs that one has to take a person more advanced on the path, much more advanced and self-realized, and take shelter of that person, because that person is a representative of him. And indeed, that is the correct process. The statement of that there's no need of another instrument means that one doesn't need the instrument of one's mental capacity to become self-illumined. Rather, that the knowledge is there, and it's through the process of revelation. And the soul, in taking the personalist approach, comes to realize those truths by virtue of being a spirit soul. But indeed, always the emphasis is on viewing oneself as being the person that's been, the soul that's been sheltered by somebody who's sheltering. And indeed, the more advanced transcendentalist gives shelter as a representative of Krishna to the person who's taking the sheltered role. Yes, indeed. And you had a third point. No, okay. Thank you very much. Because yes, it could be slightly misunderstood, but thank you. I'm using the language used by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Well, thank you very much for your very kind attention. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.